Picture this. April 23rd, 1945. A secret underground facility buried 300 feet beneath the Harz Mountains in Germany. The air is thick with smoke. The walls are shaking from Allied bombing runs happening miles above. And in this concrete tomb, a group of scientists are doing something absolutely unthinkable. They're destroying their own work, not just any work. We're talking about years, sometimes decades of research, blueprints for weapons that could have changed the entire war, revolutionary technology that wouldn't be fully understood until the 21st century. They're burning documents, smashing prototypes, flooding laboratories, demolishing equipment with sledgehammers, and in some cases, swallowing cyanide pills to take secrets to their graves. But here's the part that'll blow your mind. These weren't just any weapons. We're talking about jet engines that broke the sound barrier, rockets that reached the edge of space, infrared technology that could see in complete darkness, chemical weapons so deadly that a microscopic dose could kill you in under 2 minutes. And according to recently declassified CIA documents, possibly even early work on atomic weapons that could have made the Hiroshima bomb look like a firecracker. Some of this technology was so advanced that when Allied intelligence officers first saw it, they thought it was science fiction. One American colonel reportedly said, "If this is real, we're not fighting World War II. We're fighting World War III before it even started. So why would they destroy it all? Why would brilliant scientists, facing capture or death, choose to obliterate knowledge that could have saved their lives?" The answer is way more disturbing and complex than you think. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some knowledge might be too dangerous to exist. What's up, everyone? If you're new here, welcome to the channel where we dive deep into the most fascinating, most controversial, and often completely overlooked stories from history. The kind of stories that textbooks skip over because they're too complicated, too dark, or too uncomfortable. And trust me, today's story checks all those boxes and then some. Before we get into it, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications because we're covering some seriously mind-blowing historical mysteries on this channel, and you definitely don't want to miss what's coming. We've got episodes planned on Operation Paperclip, the classified files that are still sealed today, and the Nazi scientists who literally got away with murder. This is just the beginning. And real quick, if you appreciate the amount of research that goes into these videos, the deep dives, the declassified documents I dig through, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this content to more people who love history as much as we do. Now, let's set the stage properly because this story doesn't start in 1945. It starts way earlier, and understanding the full context is crucial. When most Americans think about World War II ending in 1945, we picture VE Day celebrations. Soldiers kissing nurses in Times Square. Victory parades. The world finally at peace after 6 years of absolute hell. That's the Hollywood version, and it's partially true. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Something that would shape the next 70 years of human history. There was a desperate race. And it wasn't about winning the war anymore. The war was already won. This race was about controlling what came after it. See, the Allied forces, particularly the Americans and the Soviets, weren't just trying to capture German cities and accept surrenders. They were hunting for something far more valuable than territory. They were hunting for knowledge, for scientists, for blueprints, for technology, for the secrets that Germany had been developing in hidden laboratories across occupied Europe. And here's what most people don't realize. German scientists had been working on weapons technology that was 20, sometimes 30, in a few cases 50 years ahead of anything the United States or Britain had. I'm not exaggerating. When American engineers first examined some of the captured German technology, they literally couldn't figure out how it worked. The physics seemed impossible with 1945 understanding. We're talking about operational jet fighters when the Allies were still flying propeller planes. Ballistic missiles that could reach the edge of space when American rockets could barely fly 50 miles. Infrared night vision that could see in complete darkness. Nerve agents so advanced and so terrifying that even Hitler, despite being perfectly willing to commit genocide, refused to use them on the battlefield because he feared the retaliation. But here's where the story takes its wild turn. As the Allies closed in from the west and the Soviets closed in from the east, these German scientists, these brilliant minds who had created world-changing technology, faced an impossible choice. And many of them made a decision that still puzzles historians today. They chose destruction over survival. Let's talk about what these scientists had actually created, because to understand why they destroyed it, you need to understand just how revolutionary and terrifying this technology really was. By 1943, Germany knew it was losing the war. The question wasn't if they'd lose, but when. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Allies had air superiority. The Atlantic was no longer safe for U-boats. Resources were running out, time was running out, everything was running out. So Hitler became absolutely obsessed with what he called Wunderwaffen, literally wonder weapons. These were supposed to be game-changing technologies that could turn the tide of the war overnight. Secret weapons that would terrify the Allies into surrender. Superweapons that would make conventional military forces obsolete. Now here's the thing that most documentaries gloss over. Hitler's obsession was partly delusional, yes, but it wasn't completely insane, because some of these wonder weapons actually worked, and a few of them were genuinely revolutionary. Let me start with the big one, the V-2 rocket. And I want you to understand what this thing actually was, because calling it just a weapon doesn't do it justice. The V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It stood 46 feet tall. It weighed 27,000 pounds at launch. It was powered by liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel. It could fly at 3,500 miles per hour. That's about Mach 4.6, faster than a bullet from many rifles. It could reach altitudes of 55 miles, well above the Kármán line that we consider the boundary of space today. And it could strike targets 200 miles away with a 1-ton warhead. For context, and this is important, the V-2 rocket flew higher and faster than any Allied aircraft could even dream of reaching. When V-2s started raining down on London and Antwerp in September 1944, there was no warning system. No radar could track something moving that fast at that altitude. No fighter plane could intercept it. No anti-aircraft gun could shoot it down. The first warning civilians had was the explosion. Over 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched during the war, killing more than 7,000 civilians and military personnel. But here's the statistic that really puts things in perspective. The V-2 program killed more people building the rockets than it did as a weapon. Around 20,000 concentration camp prisoners, mostly from the Mittelbau-Dora camp, died in the underground factories where these rockets were assembled. They died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and executions. Think about that level of desperation and cruelty. The Nazi regime was literally working people to death to build weapons that weren't even winning the war. But from a pure technology standpoint, the V-2 was decades ahead of its time. When American scientists examined captured V-2s after the war, they were stunned. The guidance systems, the fuel injection, the aerodynamics, all of it was more sophisticated than anything in the Allied arsenal. The V-2 essentially became the basis for both the American and Soviet space programs. The Saturn V rocket that put Americans on the moon in 1969 was a direct descendant of the V-2. Now let's talk about the Messerschmitt Me-262, because this aircraft was genuinely revolutionary. This was the world's first operational jet fighter, not a prototype, not an experimental aircraft. A full production combat jet that saw extensive action in the final year of the war. The Me-262 could fly at speeds of 540 miles per hour, about 120 miles faster than the best Allied propeller-driven fighters. German pilots called it flying like a bullet through butter. In the hands of an experienced pilot, the Me-262 was virtually untouchable. It could zoom through Allied bomber formations, fire its 30mm cannons, and be gone before Allied escort fighters could even react. There are documented cases of single Me-262s shooting down multiple Allied aircraft in a single sortie. The problem? Germany ran out of everything needed to produce them in quantity: fuel, rare metals, experienced pilots, and most critically, time. If the Me-262 had been deployed in large numbers 2 years earlier, the air war over Europe would have looked very different. But there's a tragic irony here. Hitler himself delayed the Me-262's deployment by almost a year, because he wanted it modified as a bomber instead of a fighter. He was obsessed with retaliation bombing and refused to see the aircraft's true potential as an interceptor. That delay probably saved thousands of Allied lives. But wait, because we're just getting started. The V-2 and Me-262 are famous. What about the weapons programs most people have never heard of? The Horton-Ho 229. This was a jet-powered flying wing aircraft that was essentially a prototype stealth bomber. It had no tail, no conventional fuselage, just a wing with engines embedded in it. The design naturally reduced radar cross-section, though the Germans didn't fully understand radar stealth yet. When the US examined this aircraft after the war, they classified the information. The design influenced the B-2 stealth bomber developed 40 years later. Wire-guided anti-tank missiles. Germany developed the X-4 and X-7 missiles, which a soldier could guide onto target using a small joystick. This was the first practical fire-and-forget anti-tank weapon system. The technology wouldn't appear in American arsenals until the 1970s. Infrared night vision. German scientists developed the Vampire system, which combined an infrared spotlight with a special scope that could detect the reflected IR light. This allowed soldiers to see and shoot in complete darkness. The first operational night vision device in military history. Tabun and sarin nerve gas. These weapons are so horrific I almost don't want to describe them. These organophosphate nerve agents attack the nervous system. Exposure causes uncontrollable muscle spasms, seizures, respiratory failure, and death within minutes. A single drop on your skin could kill you. Germany manufactured thousands of tons of these agents, but never used them in combat, partly because Hitler had been gassed in World War I, and partly because of fear of Allied retaliation. Advanced submarine technology, the type of U-boat, was years ahead of any Allied submarine. It could run submerged for days, dive deeper, and move faster underwater than any previous submarine. If it had been deployed earlier in the war, the Battle of the Atlantic could have been lost. And then there's the biggest question of all: how close did Germany come to building an atomic bomb? This is still debated by historians today, partly because so much evidence was deliberately destroyed. What we know for certain is that Germany had a nuclear research program led by Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics and a Nobel Prize winner. They had uranium. They had heavy water from Norway. They had brilliant physicists. What they didn't have was the massive industrial capacity, the resources, or the time needed to build a working bomb. Most historians now believe Germany was never close to a functioning nuclear weapon. But there are declassified documents that suggest the research was more advanced than we initially thought. And here's what's terrifying. We'll never know exactly how far they got, because so much research was destroyed in those final weeks of the war. By early 1945, the German war machine had produced some of the most advanced military technology on Earth. But they were running out of everything: time, territory, resources, and hope. Now, here's where this story transforms from a tale of military technology into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. Because the end of World War II wasn't really the end. It was a transition, the beginning of a new conflict. And the prize in this new conflict wasn't territory. It was knowledge. Sometime in late 1944, American military intelligence had an absolutely terrifying realization. They had been capturing German weapons technology, examining it. They started to understand something that should have been obvious, but somehow was unt. Germany had been innovating far faster than anyone realized. Every time Allied forces captured a new German research facility, they found technology that shouldn't exist yet. Things that American engineers and scientists said were theoretically possible, but decades away from practical implementation. And these weren't just sitting in labs as concepts. These were operational weapon systems being used in combat. The American military brass started asking urgent questions. What else are they working on that we don't know about? What happens if the Soviets capture this technology before we do? And most importantly, how do we make sure the scientists who understand this technology end up working for us and not for Stalin? Because here's what most people don't understand about the final months of World War II. There were essentially 3 separate military campaigns happening simultaneously. First, there was the obvious one: the Western Allies pushing into Germany from the west, the Soviets pushing from the east, everyone trying to force a German surrender as quickly as possible. Second, there was the secret campaign: American, British, and Soviet intelligence units racing each other to capture specific factories, research facilities, and scientific installations. They had target lists, priority rankings, dedicated military units whose sole job was to secure scientific assets. And third, there was an even more secret campaign that most soldiers on the ground didn't know about: Operation Paperclip. Let me tell you about Operation Paperclip, because this program is one of the most controversial decisions in American history, and most Americans still don't know the full story. The initial name was actually Operation Overcast, but it was renamed Operation Paperclip because they attached paperclips to the files of scientists they wanted to recruit, marking them as priority targets for evacuation to the United States. The scale of this operation is staggering. Between 1945 and 1959, the United States recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. These weren't low-level lab assistants. These were the elite of German military research, the people who had designed the V-2 rocket, jet engines, advanced chemical weapons, and cutting-edge physics research. But here's where it gets really controversial. Many of these scientists were known Nazi Party members. Some had been directly involved in war crimes. They had used concentration camp labor. They had conducted experiments on prisoners. They had been willing participants in one of history's most evil regimes. And the US government knew all of this. They knew it, and they recruited them anyway. How did they justify this? They literally rewrote the backgrounds of Nazi scientists to get them into America, bypassing laws that would have prevented known Nazi Party members from entering the country. Intelligence officers would sanitize files, removing or downplaying Nazi affiliations, covering up war crimes, creating false documentation. President Truman had explicitly ordered that no ardent Nazis be brought to America. His order was systematically ignored by intelligence agencies who argued that the scientific knowledge was too valuable to lose. Let me give you the most famous example: Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was the technical director of the V-2 rocket program. He was a member of the Nazi Party and held an officer rank in the SS. He personally visited the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp where his rockets were being built by slave labor. He knew prisoners were being worked to death. There's evidence suggesting he personally selected prisoners for certain tasks. In any reasonable post-war justice system, von Braun should have faced trial for war crimes. Thousands of people died building his rockets. Instead, he became one of the most celebrated figures in American history. Von Braun and his team of about 120 German rocket scientists deliberately fled from the advancing Soviet forces in the final weeks of the war. They had access to trucks, gasoline, and V-2 components. Instead of heading to Berlin or trying to defend the fatherland, they headed toward the American lines in Bavaria. They had a plan. They had documents. They had a list of what their knowledge was worth. When they surrendered to American forces on May 2, 1945, von Braun's brother had a prepared speech emphasizing their value to the American military. And it worked. Von Braun went from Nazi war criminal to American hero. He became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He appeared on television with Walt Disney, explaining space travel to American children. He designed the Saturn V rocket that put Americans on the moon. When Neil Armstrong walked on the lunar surface in 1969, he was standing on technology developed by a former Nazi SS officer. Let that sink in for a moment. The same man who oversaw the construction of weapons that killed thousands of civilians in London later became the face of American space exploration. American schools taught kids to admire him. He received the National Medal of Science from President Ford. Now, the Soviets were doing the exact same thing, they just weren't as good at the publicity. When Soviet forces reached German research facilities, they didn't ask nicely. They didn't sanitize records or worry about the moral implications. They just took what they wanted. The Soviets forcibly relocated entire teams of German scientists to the Soviet Union. In some cases, they literally loaded scientists and their families onto trains in the middle of the night and shipped them east. Over 2,000 German specialists ended up working in Soviet facilities, many against their will. Some went willingly. The communist ideology appealed to some German intellectuals who were horrified by what Nazi Germany had become. Others were pragmatists who saw the Soviets as their best chance for survival. Many had no choice at all. The Soviet program was less famous than Operation Paperclip, but arguably just as significant. German scientists helped the Soviet Union develop their first jet fighters, their first ballistic missiles, their rocket program. The technology gap between the superpowers would have been much wider without captured German expertise. This is important to understand. The Americans and Soviets weren't just competing with each other. They were racing against time and against the scientists themselves. Because not every German scientist wanted to be captured. Some had their own plans, some disappeared, some committed suicide, and some, and this is the crucial point, made a deliberate choice to destroy their own work. Intelligence officers on both sides reported the same frustrating pattern. They would arrive at a research facility only to find laboratories flooded, equipment smashed, documents burned, and sometimes the scientists themselves dead by their own hand. Why? That's what we're going to explore next. But first, understand the context. These scientists knew they had created something world-changing. They knew both superpowers wanted them. They knew their knowledge could determine the balance of power for decades. And they had to make a choice about what to do with that power. Some chose America, some chose the Soviet Union, and some chose destruction. So here's the central mystery of this entire story. If this knowledge was so valuable, if it could have saved their lives, if it could have made them wealthy and celebrated in either America or the Soviet Union, why did some German scientists destroy it? The answer is complicated. It's dark. And it reveals something profound about human nature, about the responsibility of scientists, and about the weight of knowledge itself. First, let's talk about what was actually destroyed, because the scale is staggering. As Allied and Soviet forces closed in on German research facilities in early 1945, something extraordinary happened at multiple locations across Germany, Austria, and occupied Czechoslovakia. Scientists began systematically destroying their own research. They burned documents, thousands upon thousands of pages of research notes, experimental data, test results, and blueprints. They smashed equipment. They flooded laboratories. They poured acid on prototypes. They demolished production facilities. And in some cases, they took their own lives to ensure their secrets died with them. This wasn't random destruction. This wasn't panic. This was systematic, deliberate obliteration of knowledge. And it happened at multiple sites, suggesting either coordination or a shared understanding among German scientists about what needed to be done. Let me give you some specific examples that we know about from declassified documents and post-war investigations. At the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, where cutting-edge physics research was being conducted, scientists reportedly destroyed entire libraries of research data in the final weeks of the war. Werner Heisenberg, one of Germany's top physicists and a Nobel Prize winner, allegedly coordinated the destruction of sensitive nuclear research documents. He later claimed in interviews that Germany had never been close to building an atomic bomb, but historians debate whether he was telling the truth or covering up how far the research had progressed. In the underground facilities in the Harz Mountains, where advanced jet and rocket research was conducted, retreating German forces demolished production lines and research centers before the Americans arrived. The Nordhausen complex, which produced V-2 rockets, was partially blown up. Critical machine tools were destroyed, specialized equipment was smashed or buried. At research installations near Peenemünde, the main rocket development facility, there's evidence that scientists destroyed advanced guidance system research and experimental propulsion designs. When American technical teams arrived, they found sophisticated equipment reduced to scrap metal. But perhaps the most chilling examples involve individual scientists who chose death over capture. There are documented cases of chemists who worked on nerve agents taking their own lives with their own creations. Imagine that choice, swallowing a vial of nerve gas you personally helped develop, knowing it will kill you in horrific agony within minutes because you don't want that knowledge to be extracted from you under interrogation. There are reports of aeronautical engineers who destroyed prototype aircraft designs and then shot themselves, of physicists who burned their research notes and took cyanide, of mathematicians who encrypted their work and swallowed the keys. One case that haunts historians, a German aeronautical engineer whose name was never definitively identified, reportedly wrote a note before taking his own life. The note, according to Allied intelligence reports, said something along the lines of, "Some technology is too dangerous for mankind. I hope this destruction buys the world a few more years of peace." Think about what that means. This person looked at what he had created and decided humanity wasn't ready for it, that the risk of it being used outweighed any benefit it might provide. So why? Why destroy knowledge that could have been your ticket to safety, wealth, and respect? Why choose death over cooperation? Historians have identified four main motivations, and they're not mutually exclusive. Many scientists probably acted from a combination of these reasons. Reason 1. Some scientists were true believers in the Nazi cause. They had bought into the ideology completely. For them, the idea of helping the enemies who defeated Germany was unthinkable. They would rather see their work destroyed than see it used by Americans or Soviets. They would rather die than live in a world where the Third Reich had been defeated. This is the darkest motivation, but it was real for some. Nazi indoctrination ran deep. Some scientists couldn't separate their personal identity from the regime they had served. The destruction of Germany felt like the destruction of their entire worldview, and they couldn't psychologically survive that transition. These scientists didn't destroy their work to protect humanity. They destroyed it to deny their enemies a victory. It was a final act of spite, a middle finger to the Allied forces. Not heroism, just fanaticism. Reason 2. Many scientists knew their work had been used for horrific purposes. They knew about the slave labor. They knew about the civilian casualties. They knew about the war crimes. And they were terrified of what would happen if they were put on trial. For these scientists, destroying the evidence and dying on their own terms seemed like the better option compared to facing a Nuremberg trial, potential execution, or years in prison. Some intelligence reports suggest that certain scientists destroyed research specifically related to human experimentation, chemical weapons testing on prisoners, and other atrocities. They weren't trying to keep dangerous knowledge from the superpowers. They were trying to cover up murder. This motivation is complicated because sometimes fear of retribution was justified and sometimes it was paranoid. Some scientists who feared prosecution were indeed guilty of serious war crimes. Others had done nothing beyond standard military research but convinced themselves they would be executed anyway. Reason 3. This is perhaps the most interesting and tragic reason. As the war ended and the full scale of Nazi atrocities became clear, some scientists experienced genuine moral horror at what they had created and what they had been part of. They saw the concentration camps being liberated, they saw the newsreels, they talked to civilians. They understood, perhaps for the first time, the true evil of the regime they had served. And they couldn't live with what they'd done. For some scientists, this meant destroying their work as an act of penance. They couldn't undo the deaths their weapons had caused, but they could at least prevent future deaths. They could at least try to make amends. There are records of scientists who had nervous breakdowns when they saw footage of concentration camp liberation, who realized that their advanced technology had been built on a foundation of slavery and genocide, who understood that every breakthrough they celebrated had been purchased with innocent blood. One German physicist, interviewed years after the war, described this moment of realization. "We thought we were serving science. We thought we were serving our country. Then we saw the camps, and we understood we had been serving hell itself." Reason 4. Some scientists didn't want either side to have their work. They saw the coming Cold War. They understood that their weapons technology would lead to an arms race that could threaten all of humanity, so they chose to take it to their graves. This is the most morally complex motivation. These weren't scientists acting out of ideology or fear or guilt. These were scientists making a deliberate, rational calculation that their technology was too dangerous to exist in the world that was coming. They looked at the geopolitical situation. They saw two superpowers emerging, hostile to each other, armed with nuclear weapons. They understood that their advanced rocket technology, chemical weapons, and guidance systems would accelerate this arms race. They did the math and decided that hiding or destroying this knowledge might delay catastrophe. Were they right? That's an impossible question to answer. But consider this. If German scientists had not destroyed certain chemical weapons research, would the Cold War have seen widespread use of nerve agents? If advanced rocket guidance systems had been fully preserved, would the Cuban Missile Crisis have ended differently? We can't know. But those scientists made a choice based on their best judgment about what would protect humanity. Now here's what makes this story even more complicated. Some of the knowledge that was destroyed wasn't just weapons technology. It was scientific knowledge that could have had civilian applications. Advanced metallurgy research that could have improved manufacturing. Physics data that could have advanced our understanding of the universe. Engineering principles that could have been used for peaceful purposes. When you destroy knowledge, you can't be selective about the consequences. The scientists who burned their research destroyed both the dangerous applications and the potentially beneficial ones. Was it worth it? Again, impossible to say. But it's a question that resonates today more than ever. Now here's where the story gets really thought-provoking and enters almost philosophical territory. What was actually lost? What survived? And did the destruction actually make any meaningful difference? The honest, frustrating answer is, we'll never fully know what was destroyed. By definition, if knowledge was successfully obliterated, we can't know what it contained. We can only make educated guesses based on partial information, hints in surviving documents, and what later emerged. But we can piece together some of the story from what happened after the war. Let's start with rockets, since we have the most information here. The Americans captured von Braun and his team, along with enough documentation and hardware to understand the basics of the V-2 rocket. They also captured 100 V-2 rockets in various states of completion. This gave them a huge head start in rocket development. But here's what's interesting. For years after the war, both American and Soviet rocket programs struggled to replicate some of the advanced propulsion systems the Germans had been testing. Some of the metallurgy was lost. Specific fuel mixture formulas that had been optimized through testing were gone. Advanced guidance algorithms were incomplete. Why? Because the Germans had been working on next-generation systems beyond the V-2. Rockets that could reach even higher altitudes, more accurate guidance, better propulsion efficiency. And much of that research was destroyed or hidden. There are intelligence reports from the 1950s where American scientists express frustration that they are having to rediscover solutions that German engineers had already figured out, but the documentation was lost. Think about the inefficiency of that. Brilliant minds spending years resolving problems that had already been solved because the original solutions were deliberately destroyed. In aeronautics, the story of the Horten-Ho 229 flying wing is fascinating and mysterious. The Horten brothers created a jet-powered flying wing that was decades ahead of its time. The Americans captured 3 prototypes at various stages of completion. But the complete design documents, the mathematical calculations behind the wing shape, the materials research, much of that was gone. The U.S. examined what they had and classified it immediately. For decades, almost nothing about the Horten-Ho 229 was publicly known. Then, in the 1980s, when the B-2 stealth bomber was being developed, it became clear that some of the principles were similar. Did the B-2 engineers have access to classified Horten research? We don't know for certain, but the similarities are striking. What we do know is that if all the Horten research had survived, the B-2 might have been developed 10 or 20 years earlier. For chemical weapons, there's strong evidence that significant research was deliberately destroyed or hidden, and thank God for that. Germany had manufactured thousands of tons of taboon and sarin nerve gas. They had detailed research on production methods, dispersion techniques, and antidotes. After the war, the Allies captured some of this information, but reports suggest that key research was destroyed by German chemists who didn't want this knowledge to proliferate. Some of those chemists took their own lives using the nerve agents they had created. It's a horrific thought, but it meant that certain specific production techniques died with them. Now, obviously, nerve agents still proliferated. Other countries developed their own, but there's evidence that the destruction of some German research delayed certain developments by years or even decades. The most debated question in all of this is about nuclear research. Werner Heisenberg was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, a Nobel Prize winner, and the head of Germany's nuclear program. After the war, he claimed that Germany had never seriously pursued an atomic bomb, that the research was focused on nuclear energy for civilian purposes. Many historians don't believe him. There's evidence that German nuclear research was more advanced than Heisenberg admitted, but we can't know for certain because key documents were destroyed. In 2018, historians in Norway found previously unknown documents about German nuclear research hidden in an archive. These documents changed our understanding of how close Germany came to a working nuclear reactor, and it raised the question, what other documents were destroyed? What did Heisenberg and his colleagues deliberately obliterate? Some historians believe Heisenberg destroyed evidence not just of weapons research, but of how far that research had progressed. He didn't want the world to know how close Germany came. Whether that was to protect his reputation, or because he genuinely felt guilt, or because he wanted to ensure that knowledge stayed buried, we'll never know. Now, here's where this gets into conspiracy theory territory, but some of these theories have just enough credibility to be worth mentioning. Some historians and researchers believe that certain German scientists didn't destroy their research. Instead, they think it was hidden, buried, encoded, smuggled out of Germany to be preserved in secret. The most common theory involves research being smuggled to South America, particularly Argentina, which accepted many Nazi refugees after the war. Some claim that advanced aircraft designs, chemical weapons formulas, and even nuclear research documents were preserved in hidden archives. Is this true? Probably not in the dramatic way these theories suggest. But is it possible that some research survived in hidden archives? Yes, it's possible. Every few years, someone finds documents in an attic or in a forgotten archive or in a family's private papers, and we learn something new about what was created and what was lost. Here's what's really interesting. We're still finding German World War II research documents. In 2005, a researcher found advanced jet engine designs in a Polish archive that nobody knew existed. In 2012, a family in Argentina discovered papers belonging to a German scientist that detailed chemical research thought to have been destroyed. In 2018, those Norwegian nuclear documents I mentioned earlier, each discovery changes our understanding slightly, and each discovery raises the question, what else is out there? What knowledge is still hidden, waiting to be discovered? So here's the big philosophical question. Did destroying that knowledge actually help or hurt humanity? Let me give you both sides of this argument because there's no easy answer. You could argue that delaying certain weapons technology saved lives. The Cold War was tense enough with the weapons both sides had. If the Soviets and Americans had immediately acquired advanced chemical weapons formulas, more sophisticated guided missile technology, better jet fighter designs, and more advanced nuclear research in 1945, the arms race could have accelerated beyond control. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The world came within hours of nuclear war. Both sides had their fingers on the trigger. Now imagine if that crisis had happened in 1950, with both sides having even more advanced weapon systems. The chance of miscalculation increases dramatically. Maybe those German scientists who destroyed their work bought humanity time. Time to develop international laws, time to establish treaties, time to create safeguards, time to understand the implications of these weapons before deploying them. There's also an argument that the destruction forced scientists in America and the Soviet Union to independently rediscover these technologies, which meant they developed them more carefully with more understanding of the fundamental principles rather than just copying designs they didn't fully comprehend. On the other hand, you could argue that destroying scientific knowledge is always a net negative for humanity. Some of that destroyed research was pure science, physics data, engineering principles, mathematical models. That knowledge could have advanced civilian technology. It could have improved manufacturing, transportation, and energy production. It could have saved lives if it had been preserved and eventually declassified. By destroying it, those scientists didn't just hide weapons technology. They set back human knowledge in general. And there's no way to know what beneficial applications might have come from that research. There's also the argument that the destruction didn't really stop anything. Other countries developed similar weapons anyway. The arms race happened regardless. All the destruction did was ensure that scientists had to waste time rediscovering things that were already known. If you believe that scientific knowledge is inherently neutral, that it's how we use it that matters, then destroying knowledge is always wrong. It's like burning a library because some of the books contain dangerous ideas. But here's the part that makes this discussion really uncomfortable. Not all the knowledge was destroyed for noble reasons. Some Nazi scientists destroyed evidence of human experimentation, of atrocities, of war crimes. That destruction wasn't about preventing an arms race or protecting humanity from dangerous weapons. It was about covering up murder. When we talk about destroyed research, we need to remember that some of that research was conducted on concentration camp prisoners. Some of those experiments were torture sessions dressed up in scientific language. Some of that data represented the suffering and death of innocent people. So, when those scientists destroyed their research, were they destroying dangerous knowledge or evidence of crimes? The answer is often both. The truth is, we're still discovering what was saved and what was lost from that chaotic period in 1945. Archives open, families find papers, governments declassify documents, and our understanding changes. In 2019, a researcher at MIT discovered that certain advanced aerodynamics calculations used in modern supersonic aircraft were actually rediscoveries of work done by German engineers in 1944. The original research had been partially destroyed, and it took 75 years for scientists to arrive back at the same conclusions. In 2020, documents were found suggesting that German scientists had developed early computer programming concepts for guidance systems. These concepts were destroyed or lost and had to be independently rediscovered in the 1960s. The pattern keeps repeating. We find fragments of what was destroyed, realize it was more advanced than we thought, and understand that we're still dealing with the consequences of those decisions made in 1945. So here we are, almost 80 years after the end of World War II, and we're still wrestling with the decisions those German scientists made in 1945. Let me bring this full circle and talk about why this story matters today, right now, more than ever before. Here's what we can say with confidence. In 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, some of the world's most advanced scientists faced an impossible choice. They had created revolutionary technology. They knew their knowledge was valuable. They knew both superpowers wanted them, and they had to decide what to do with that power. Some chose America. They made the calculation that working for the United States gave them the best chance of survival and success. Some of them became heroes. Some of them lived with guilt, but they chose survival and cooperation. Some chose the Soviet Union, either willingly or by force. They rebuilt Soviet science. They helped create the technology that would compete with America throughout the Cold War. Their choice shaped the balance of power for half a century. And some chose destruction. They looked at what they had created and said, "No, this ends with me." They burned documents. They destroyed prototypes. And in some cases, they took their own lives to ensure their secrets died with them. Were they heroes or cowards? The answer depends on their motivations. Some were true believers in Nazism, destroying their work to deny the enemy a victory. Those weren't heroes. Some were criminals trying to cover up atrocities. Those definitely weren't heroes. But some were scientists who experienced a genuine moral awakening, who saw what their technology had been used for and couldn't live with it, who made a conscious choice to try to prevent future harm, even if it meant sacrificing themselves. And some were forward-thinking individuals who saw the Cold War coming, who understood the dangers of an accelerated arms race, who made a calculated decision that humanity might be better off without certain technologies, at least for a while. For those scientists, I think hero might be too strong a word, but conscientious fits. Responsible fits. They took responsibility for what they had created in a way that most people never do. Now here's why this story is so relevant today. We're living through a period of incredibly rapid technological advancement. Artificial intelligence that can create deep fakes indistinguishable from reality. Gene editing technology that can modify human DNA. Quantum computing that could break all current encryption. Autonomous weapon systems. Synthetic biology. Every day, scientists are creating technologies with the potential to fundamentally change human society, for better or worse. And those scientists are facing the same question those German scientists faced in 1945. Just because we can create something, does that mean we should? And once that knowledge exists, can it be controlled? There are AI researchers today who are deliberately not publishing certain research because they fear the potential for misuse. There are biologists who have voluntarily redacted details from papers about dangerous pathogens. There are physicists who advocate for restrictions on certain areas of research. They're making the same calculation those German scientists made. Is this knowledge too dangerous to exist freely in the world? And here's the uncomfortable truth. There's no universally right answer to that question. It depends on the specific technology. It depends on the geopolitical situation. It depends on who might use it and how. But here's what we've learned from the story of 1945. Once knowledge exists, it's almost impossible to destroy completely. Those German scientists burned documents, smashed equipment, and took secrets to their graves. And yet, much of that knowledge was reconstructed. Other scientists in other countries rediscovered the same principles. You can delay the spread of knowledge. You can make it harder to access. But you probably can't eliminate it permanently, not in a world where thousands of smart people are working on similar problems. So if destruction doesn't work, what does? That's the trillion-dollar question. Maybe the answer is better international cooperation, treaties that restrict certain research, transparency about what's being developed, ethical frameworks that guide scientists. Maybe the answer is accepting that dangerous knowledge will exist and focusing on preventing its misuse rather than preventing its creation. I don't have the answer. Nobody does. But the story of 1945 teaches us that individuals and governments will continue to face these choices, and the decisions they make will shape the future of humanity. Let's not forget the other side of this story. Operation Paperclip fundamentally shaped the modern world. The scientists who chose cooperation rather than destruction created the space program, advanced jet aviation, modern computing, and much more. Without Operation Paperclip, would Americans have landed on the moon in 1969? Probably not. Would the Cold War have ended differently? Possibly. But we also have to grapple with the moral cost. We celebrated Nazi scientists as heroes. We gave them positions of honor and authority. We let them write the history of their own work. And in doing so, we sent a message. If your knowledge is valuable enough, your past can be erased. Is that the right message? I don't know, but it's the choice that was made. So what do I think about those scientists who destroyed their work? I think they were human. Complex, flawed, contradictory humans facing an impossible situation. Some made their choice out of ideology, some out of fear, some out of guilt, and some out of a genuine desire to protect humanity from what they had created. Were they right? History doesn't give us a clear answer. Some of the weapons they tried to hide were redeveloped anyway. Some of the knowledge was reconstructed. But maybe they bought us time. Maybe those few years of delay mattered. Or maybe they just recognized something fundamental, that scientists have a responsibility that goes beyond just discovering how things work. They have a responsibility to think about what happens when that knowledge enters the world. They have an obligation to consider the consequences. And sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is to choose not to share what you know. Now I want to hear from you. This is not a simple story with a clear moral. This is complicated, messy history with no easy answers. Do you think those scientists were right to destroy their research? Or do you think knowledge should never be destroyed, regardless of the potential consequences? If you were a scientist working on revolutionary but potentially dangerous technology today, what would you do? Would you publish your findings openly? Would you limit access? Would you destroy your work? These aren't hypothetical questions. Researchers around the world are facing these dilemmas right now, and the choices they make will affect all of us. Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your perspective. And be thoughtful about it. These are hard questions. Don't just give me a knee-jerk reaction. Think about the complexities. Think about the trade-offs. Think about what you would actually do if you were in that position. If you made it this far, congratulations. This was a long, complex video, and I appreciate you sticking with it. If you found this story as fascinating and thought-provoking as I do, please smash that like button. It really helps the algorithm show this content to more people who care about history and these big philosophical questions about technology and responsibility. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because next week we're going even deeper into Operation Paperclip. And we're going to talk about the specific Nazi scientists who came to America, what they did during the war, what they did in America, and the classified programs some of them worked on that are still partially secret today. Some of those stories are going to make you uncomfortable. Some of them are going to make you angry, but they're all true. They're all documented. And they're all part of American history that we need to understand. I've also got upcoming episodes on the Nazi scientists who went to Argentina and what they did there, the Soviet equivalent of Operation Paperclip and how it shaped the space race, the classified weapons programs of the 1950s that used German technology, and the modern-day implications of all of this for AI, biotechnology, and military research. This is just the beginning of a deep dive into one of the most fascinating and morally complex periods in modern history. Before I go, I want to leave you with one last thought. The scientists who destroyed their research in 1945 made a choice about knowledge and responsibility. Whether you think they were right or wrong, they at least took their responsibility seriously. They at least considered the implications of what they had created. In today's world, where we're developing technology faster than ever before, where we're creating capabilities that could reshape human civilization, we need more people willing to think seriously about these questions. We need scientists who don't just ask, can we, but should we? We need policymakers who understand the technology they're regulating. We need citizens who are informed enough to participate in these debates. Because the next set of technologies that gets developed, whether that's advanced AI, gene editing, quantum weapons, or something we haven't even imagined yet, those technologies will shape the world your children and grandchildren live in. And the choices we make now about how to handle dangerous knowledge will echo through generations. The German scientists of 1945 teach us that these choices matter, that individual decisions can have massive consequences, and that sometimes the weight of knowledge is almost too heavy to bear. Until next week, stay curious, keep questioning everything, think deeply about the implications of technology, and I'll see you in the next video.